Hi again, everyone. I'm Ollie Matthews. This is the Narcissistic Resistance, and this resistance video is sponsored by contribution from the Apostle's niece, and here's her story. Hi, Ollie. I want to thank you for your thoughts on the last two letters. I really appreciate how you take time to read our stories. No therapist has ever done this for me, and your observations are quite profound. I am still thinking about what you said the last time about me being a hostage. In the previous letters, I wrote about my childhood growing up in a cult, my abusive family, and education at a strict religious college. Picking up after graduation, I embarked on my career life. As my days at college drew to a close, my friend Hajan helped me get a job as a scriptwriter at the church's television production studio, where she had been working since her graduation at the end of the story in my junior year. That is where Uncle Belch had recorded his show, which was nationally syndicated and had been broadcast for decades, up until the mid-'80s when he died. After his death, the show was given a big overhaul by the church's new leadership. Instead of just one televangelist, there are now four, and instead of sitting at a wooden desk with books and a globe in the background, they hired high-priced consultants from the East Coast to come in and build an actual news set. It was very professional looking and modern with new cameras and teleprompters. Uncle Belch had never used a teleprompter. He just gave sermons like he did in church, filmed that, and broadcasted it. He kept recording his show up until the end of his life, even when he needed oxygen bottles to get around. I could almost admire him if I didn't know how much pain he had caused so many. It was more than just taking the money from the members. It was more than all of the strict rules we adhered to. He also tapped people's phones, had them followed around, and arranged their marriages. People were told who they were allowed to marry or not marry based on his whims or preferences and what agenda he had for them. People did what they were told, what he told them to, unquestionably, because they believed he was God's apostle and that his words were inspired by the Holy Spirit. By now, times were changing rapidly. The television show was morphing into a kind of news magazine with a religious editorial segment at the end, and the presenters looked more like reporters than televangelists. But it wasn't just the TV show that was changing. The church doctrines were also being revised, and this was causing a lot of confusion among the brethren. The first time I heard the term cognitive dissonance was during a church sermon by the church's new leader following Uncle Belch's death. The message was videotaped and sent to all our congregations around the world. He explained that God had revealed to him, the new apostle, that it was okay for women to wear makeup and among other things. This caused a great deal of consternation among those who firmly believed that cosmetics were something for worldly women or prostitutes, Jezebels, and not for the properly converted women of God's one true church. But some were relieved to wear makeup, and again, myself included. Since the age of 13, I had been plucking out my eyelashes, a disorder known as trichotillomania. I have a couple people who have that on this channel. I later learned in life, which I developed in response to my environment. I kept trying to grow them in, but whenever I was anxious or depressed, which was fairly often, I started pulling them out again. So I was relieved to be able to apply a little eyeliner to disguise my disfigurement. You wouldn't believe how many people will ask you why you have no eyelashes, usually a public place in front of other people. I'm convinced that some of them do it intentionally to put you on the spot and embarrass you, but others are just completely clueless. It was not the kind of question I wanted to answer publicly, so I would usually evade it one way or another, make up some illness to explain it, or suddenly to leave. There was no one I trusted enough to talk about it with. I was so ashamed of it that I don't think I could have talked about it anyway at that time of my life. I was now 24. Working in the television department gave me a whole new insight into the leadership of the church. I wrote scripts for the show called Treatments and submitted them to my ministry for review. I attended meetings with the top evangelists and the leadership of the church, where every treatment was discussed in detail. The meetings were quite lavish, held in a finely appointed conference chambers, which my uncle had built. Hardwood paneling, expensive paintings, leather upholstery, a huge circular table as if it was Camelot. Gourmet food was brought in for the ministers to feast upon. My scripts usually came back with a lot of red ink. A couple of the ministers had very strange ideas about how scripts should be written. One in particular seemed to take a strong personal dislike to me. He did more than just edit my scripts. He questioned everything I wrote as if he was questioning my sanity. My treatments were covered with his scribbly writing and angry slashes throughout the sentences I'd written. Even though I was the former apostle's niece, there were many who were openly uncomfortable about women being given this kind of authority. At first, my name was not even included in the credits as a writer, even though I wrote all but the last few minutes of the broadcasts I worked on. The end segment, the religious part, was only written by the ministers and usually consisted of a litany of scriptures. The consultants, who were not members of the church, loved my ideas and wondered why the others didn't see things the way I did. I saw things differently because I was not really converted enough. Translation, not brainwashed enough, not broken enough. I managed to squirrel away a little piece of myself, and I kept it tightly protected, but it did not like to stay in a box. There was a writer I worked with, an evangelist from Britain. He told me one time, somewhat admonishingly, that I was like an octopus and had one tentacle of mine would always get out no matter what box it was put in. I was quite fond of him. His dry British wit did not always go over well with his colleagues in the ministry, but the congregation adored him. There were a few ministers like him who gave really uplifting sermons, full wit and deep insight. Those sermons often were so popular that people would replay them or talk excitedly about them afterwards. The pastor general, God's new apostle, was of Russian descent. I had met him several times and liked him well enough that I made him a sculpture of a Cossack on a charging horse, sword flashing above his head. I, in turn, was flattered that he kept it on his desk, but I was disturbed by some of the higher-up members of his administration. I rode with them in the limousine to editorial conferences sometimes, where they could listen to presentations by top journalists and writers, mostly about current events. The men would sit in the back of the limo and talk about the changes they were planning for the church. Is it out with the old and in with the new, or is it in with the new and out with the old? One of them quipped, they didn't even seem aware that I was in the car with them. I was not part of their circle. I was beneath their notice, so I rode up front with the driver. He was Uncle Belch's old driver and I had served with him for decades. I imagined his ears must have been burning as the new leadership discussed their plans for restructuring the church. Back at television, I was often assigned scripts which required a lot of research, and so I would drive to the bookstore to find materials. While I was there, I was also exploring the self-help section. Psychology was frowned upon by the church, of course. It was Satan's poison. We were supposed to talk with God's ministers if we had any problems, and then do what they told us to do. Their advice was, as you can imagine, not always helpful and sometimes very harmful. A friend of mine who was struggling with alcohol was told by her minister to just pour out all her booze and never buy it again, as if that would work. He knew how to weaponize shame. That same minister called me in one time because apparently the wife of a male co-worker had complained to him that her husband was calling my name out when they had sex. I was shocked. The guy had always been a bit overly friendly at work, and I was not very comfortable around him. I was not attracted to him at all, but here the minister was practically accusing me of having an affair with this man. I told him flat out that I had no interest in my coworker, but he looked at me in askance as if he didn't believe me. Privately, I did not believe the ministers spoke for God or that some of them were even all that smart. So I bought self-help books and took them home in secret to read. I had been told all my life that something was wrong with me, and I wanted to know what it was so I could fix it. Even though I had traveled the world and was working in television, I was deeply unhappy much of the time. As I read these forbidden materials, as I read these forbidden materials, I quickly came to the understanding that I had been sexually abused by both my parents. I was also becoming aware of the dynamics of our family. My mother and sisters continued to wreak havoc in my lives. My mother would call me up and say things that she knew would upset me in order to provoke a fight. I had very little to do with wannabe shrink during this time, but my second oldest half-sister called to inform me that I needed to get my boxes out of my mother's house. By now, Mother had moved twice, and I had no idea what was even in my boxes other than the toys I had left behind from childhood. I was living with a roommate in a two-bedroom apartment and had no room for more boxes. So I was also really tired of getting boxes from my mother because they were always part of some deranged plan to create some new drama and make life miserable. Like that time she made a big deal out of sending me the family crystal, only she didn't wrap any of it, and when everything arrived broken, she blamed me, then blamed UPS. My second half-sister is also a baby boomer, and I will call her Fountainhead because she is an Ayn Rand fanatic. She believes in the virtue of selfishness. Looking back on everything, I now realize decades later that she was the golden child all along, and that she, like my other half-sister, who was the scapegoat before I came along, just wanted me out of the picture. They treated me like a bastard child. After reading about a dozen psychology books, I decided to take a break from Mother. The year was 1990, and going no contact was not exactly commonplace back then. I wrote her a letter telling her I wanted no contact for 6 months, but of course she could not respect my boundaries. She never had. Just like she had come bursting into the bathroom on me as a child, she came bursting into my adult life. One of my tasks at the television studio was to deliver the mail. Even though as a full-time scriptwriter, I was assigned that one menial duty to keep me humble. One day, as I was delivering mail, I noticed my mother's familiar spidery writing on an envelope. I took the letter home to read. Mother had written to one of the presenters on the show, an evangelist who was also one of my supervisors, telling him how I stopped speaking to her and making it sound like she was just this poor woman and I was this misguided, mean-spirited daughter who needed help. I stayed awake all night wondering what to do. I probably should have just thrown the letter away, right? But I was super contentious about everything, so I delivered the letter to the evangelist myself. I told him I had opened it and explained the situation to him before he read it. His advice to me was to stop treating my mother this way because it was cruel. But at the same time, he acknowledged that my mother was not easy to get along with. He knew my mother quite well when she had lived there. Many of these people I was working with, or who I had taught or who had taught the classes in college, had known my mother because she had lived there for 20 years before I was born, raising my two sisters, who had also attended the same college. It was like a big extended family. The evangelist my mother had written to knew a lot about cruelty. I had witnessed him treating his wife like a doormat when I was at his house for dinner with a group of students. I remembered how he had yelled at her impatiently and ordered her around as if she was a servant. I had seen the light slowly fade from her eyes. She was a talented and sensitive violinist who sometimes played special music. She had accompanied me a few times. She had accompanied my mother many times before that. She had always had a big smile on her face that looked forced. There were never tears in her eyes, but they always looked sad. Eventually, she just looked hollow, as if all the energy had been drained out and all that remained was her smile, like a Cheshire cat. So I did not take the evangelist's advice. I was angry at my mother for trying to force me to break no contact by writing to one of my superiors at work. I had come to see what a master manipulator she really was, and I was determined not to give in. The more I learned about dysfunction, the more trapped I began to feel in life. I was starting to experience more frustration with the rigid control I was under. I sneaked out sometimes in my car and ate sushi, fervently glancing around to make sure I wasn't being followed or watched. I missed hearing the clop clop of my horse's hooves on the wet sand, feeling the salt air on my face. That life was so unreachable now. Like a dream, something intangible that I couldn't go back to, now that I was living in a major city where privacy was in scant supply. I drove to the top of the mountains nearby to get away sometimes, but even up there, the press of humanity was everywhere. I could hike down some lonely ravine only to find a pile of beer cans at the bottom. There was so little left of nature to escape into. Sometimes I found a quiet hilltop where I could sit and cry. I wanted out. I wanted to live my own life, but I had no idea where to go or how to leave. I tried talking to Hijan about it, but her advice was always the same. You must go where God tells you to go. She believed we were like chess pieces which God moved around on a giant chessboard, and we had to go where he or his ministers put us. Well, like I told you in my last letter, he was an engineer, and she thought like one. But I could not imagine continuing this much longer. Then, just as it seemed I was at a breaking point, a new opportunity presented itself. It was 1990 now. The Berlin Wall had come down, and only a year before, and the USSR was opening up to the West. The Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev had put into place new policies of perestroika, the restructuring, and glasnost, transparency. How ironic it all was. Our church was going through a similar transition, and the church was already making inroads into the Soviet Union, salivating over prospects of expanding its membership in this undiscovered country. It was no secret that I spoke Russian, and now I was being selected to go with a team of people to Leningrad, where we were to work for a year in kind of a joint venture with a state-run television network. How could I leave the church when my dream of going to Russia was about to come true? So I kept going along with it, hoping that this new opportunity would make things better. Maybe God was really trying to direct my life. Maybe I really did need to go where he wanted me to go. Maybe my fate was tied to Russia. Maybe I would even find love there, a crazy thought, since dating outside the church was forbidden, but I was compelled to go. There was a woman who was a longtime friend of Hijan's from where she worked at Lockheed. I will refer to her as Suka Sanara. Zarina. Suka Zarina, which means bitch queen in Russian, for reasons I will soon reveal. Suka had done most of the legwork to establish connections in the Soviet Union. She had brought some of the management of the Leningrad Committee for Television and Radio to meet with the church's editorial board. Suka practically courted me while she was trying to get the church to commit to the project in Russia. She seems like fun. She seems like a fun, free-spirited person, and I liked her at first. I made the foolish assumption that she was another gypsy like me, and that she would hit it off and have a great friendship. Boy, did I ever read her wrong. This was my first big experience with a covert narc, and I did not know what hit me. I was raised with this kind who scream and yell in rage, not the sly kind who warm up to you as a friend and then suddenly plunge a knife into your back. After we arrived in the USSR in January of '91, in weather so cold that snot freezes in your nose, Zuka Zarina began to live up to the name I had given her. After going through the rather sobering experience of Soviet customs, which I add in retrospect was small potatoes compared to the TSA, but that's another letter, we were greeted by our Soviet colleagues with bouquets of flowers, hugs, smiles, and laughter as they drove us to our new living quarters in the city, and we passed the statue of Lenin dappled in the falling snow. Dedushka Lenin, one of our colleagues exclaimed, Uncle Lenin. We were definitely not in Kansas anymore. Sukin and I were dropped off at a dormitory room at the Leningrad State University. It was tiny with one bed and a desk. There was blood on the mirror in the bathroom. We were both exhausted from the 14-hour flight, but she insisted on taking the only bed for herself. Later, Suka arranged for better accommodations, which turned out to be a 2-bedroom flat with a bed in one room and a baby's cradle in the other. Guess which one of us got to try to sleep in the cradle? Yeah, me. Obviously, it was impossible for me to sleep in a cradle, and although Suka was annoyed with me asking, I eventually convinced her to find us an apartment where we both have a bed to sleep in. The place we wound up in was a 2-bedroom flat above the apartment of one of her friends, whose name was Ivan. The largest bedroom had a big bed and French doors, and Suka immediately announced that she wouldn't be sleeping there. I was relegated to a smaller room, which had a little fold-out divan to sleep on and a desk. We shared the kitchen, bathroom, and dining room. Mostly I stayed sequestered in my room to avoid the never-pleasant Suka. To this day, I have no idea why Suka Zarina was so horrible to me. And up until we had arrived in Russia, she had been nice. But now it was as if I couldn't do anything right. I tried talking to her, but she only mocked me or became angry. She had told both Hijan and me that she was the same age that Jesus had been when he began his mission, and she believed God had chosen her to be one of his 2 witnesses, and that she was destined to do some kind of live play-by-play on Russian TV during the apocalypse. Her Russian was far superior to mine, since she was finishing up her master's in Russian literature at a prestigious West Coast university, and I was only self-taught, even though I had also taken 6 months of beginning Russian at a community college in preparation for the trip. She took advantage of her superior language skills, laughing and flirting with her Russian friends, and often refusing to translate their conversations for me. I'm not here to be your interpreter, she would say scornfully, as my Russian slowly improved. I began to understand that sometimes she was talking about me in a less favorable way. A quick search of her room one time when she was gone revealed that she was writing letters back to the ministry about me, telling them I was an emotional basket case, that I was crazy. How could God have chosen someone like this for such important work? There were also messages to her friends at the university in which she complained petulantly about how she was surrounded by incompetent people. She knew she knew it was wrong to search her room. I'm sorry. I knew it was wrong to search her room, but at that point, I was really worried about what other things she might be saying about me. Maybe I was a basket case. I suffered from anxiety and depression and would break down crying uncontrollably at times, sometimes at the most inappropriate times, and this embarrassed people or make them angry at me. Sometimes people even accused me of faking my tears so that I could get attention. But I couldn't fake it, and far from wanting attention, I was horrified when people could see the tears streaming down my face at a party, for example, where everyone was having a good time. Well, here's the thing, Apostle's niece. If there's constant histrionics, people are going to get tired of it eventually. Worst of all, I would stop crying when it started. I would not stop crying when it started. I wanted to disappear, and I did it, and I did try to hide it if I could, but sometimes there was no way out. I don't think it was just the situation with Zuka Serena that triggered me, or the isolation of being in a foreign country, but really it was my whole past coming down like a landslide. The past which I had not fully sorted out yet, and Zuka was triggering that. The other two members of our team, a couple from Australia who had graduated in my class, did not care for her either, although I will add they did not seem overly fond of me. The husband, who I will call Wallaby, was put in charge of the project, strictly because he was a man and the church did not allow women to serve in leadership positions. Zuka had done all the legwork as she resented him taking over the project. But Wallaby was only there because his wife, Wallaroo, spoke Russian. She was fluent despite a strong Aussie accent, but all he could manage was da and yet. Zuka resented that he was in charge and did not believe he was qualified to lead our team. She made fun of him to the Russians, knowing that he couldn't understand her. One time she called him by name, which sounds like the Russian word for bra, but then she giggled. The Russian guy she was joking about to him, Kirill, laughed a bit, but seemed uncomfortable. Our new Soviet colleagues did not like how there was infighting in the group. I became quite close to those. I became quite close to a few of my Russian comrades, to be honest. I had crushes on them. A part of me fantasized about running off with a Russian man, even though it was strictly forbidden by the church. My closest friends were Kirill, Koila, and Dima, their real first names. They were the only ones I could talk with honestly. They were atheists, as most Soviet Russians were, and they were more understanding than members of my team when I told them I was thinking about leaving the church. But the Russians... Wait a minute. But the Russians also tend to be very direct, to the point of bluntness at times. That could be hard to take. They told me right away that they didn't like me complaining about my colleagues and that they were tired of hearing about the church. They could be a lot of fun to joke with, and some of them enjoyed talking about deeper subjects, and sometimes they could be little assholes. They could just be a touch histrionic at times. But it sounds like you could be histrionic too. But I came to see that, contrary to what I had been raised to believe about oppressed Russians, these guys were very opinionated and they disagreed quite ferociously with a lot of profanity. Russian has a whole separate sub-language called mat, which is all profanity. You can literally carry on a conversation dropping nothing but Russian F-bombs. Excuse me. And politics were their favorite topic. They criticized Gorbachev constantly. They hated him. They hated how their country was coming apart at the seams. Despite all the uncertainty about their own futures, they were very generous, usually bestowing personal mementos rather than gifts bought at stores. One couple invited me to their dacha, where we took turns diving into a frozen lake and then took steam bath in their baina. The husband gave me his father's navy hat and epaulets. Another time, when I was riding a bus, a soldier plucked his red star from his hat and handed it to me because I had taken this picture. They were just really giving it was humbling to take their personal gifts when all I had brought was a bottle of gin from a foreign currency store or some American beer. They were grateful for the beer back then, mind you. The Russians give more with their hearts than their wallets. Well, at least back then they did. Things are changing now. Anyway, Suka Zarina became jealous of the bond I was forming with my Russian friends. She had a way with young men which I will never understand. She was in her 30s, yet flirted with younger guys in their early 20s, and they ate it up. Her fluent Russian gave her an advantage that I lacked, although Koila spoke some English, and we were able to communicate in slurry Russian and English mixed. Suka quickly tried to put a stop to our budding friendship. She told me that my friends had come to her privately and told her that I was too needy and they thought I wanted sex. I don't know if they really did talk to her or if she made that up, but I sensed the threat that she was saying reminded her sensed the threat in what she was saying and reminded her that she had been necking rather passionately the other night with her friend Maxim, a Cossack who liked to drink a bottle of vodka and then jump up on icy railings and walk across the Neva Bridge, balancing himself precariously over the far ice below. She was indignant. It was just a peck on the cheek, but I had seen them nuzzling and her neck and breasts, him nuzzling her neck and breasts, and now I had seen how much she enjoyed the attention. Your friends absolutely told her every word of that. Your friends absolutely told her every word of that. I don't even know if they're wrong, to be honest. I mean, I don't even know if they're wrong. Because you said you had crushes on them. You're repressed. You're in this cult. You're around bad people regardless. And you think you're living some kind of dream, and you're not. The ministry in charge of the project did not give us any real direction. We had brought $30,000 in computer equipment with us. That donation to the Russian television company was part of the deal the church had worked out to get us there. We were supposed to show our Russian colleagues how to use the equipment and teach English classes. What little communication there was with the church headquarters mostly happened with the Wallabies. Occasionally someone from the ministry would visit, and they always stayed in the opulent Astoria Hotel. I ate dinner there once with a group of visiting ministers, and was warned about not drinking too much when I ordered a second glass of wine. Bear in mind I was living on a Soviet wage, and wine was not something I saw every day. When the director visited, he chastised me for not learning Russian faster. He told me that I was just mimicking it and not really speaking. I thought that was very unfair. I was speaking Russian, but progress was slow. But I thought they sent you there because you could speak Russian. It's a difficult language which can take years to learn. And we had not even been there 6 months yet. The Wallabies kept to themselves, sometimes acting as if they were the only ones on the project. When they didn't give me work to do, I invented my own job. I was the only one on the project with a television background, another reason I had been chosen. So I found work helping Koila, a young producer, and taught English lessons once or twice a week after work. I also reported on life in Russia for the church's various publications. Suka refused to teach any classes and was insulted she was asked to. She believed that she was at best making connections and that she should be paid to party and hang out and network with the Russians while we did all the work. That was a source of friction between her and the Wallabies, as was her bullying of me. One day, the director of our project, an evangelist back in the States with Ukrainian heritage, called to speak with Suka and myself. He talked with her for a long time, and I had no idea what they spoke about because she locked her bedroom doors. When it was my turn to talk to him, I tried to tell him how hard it was living with her, but he cut me off before I could finish one sentence, telling me that if we did not get along, he would send me home. Am I clear? He asked. Crystal, I asked. And that was the end of the call. You also got to remember who your mother is. So your mother, you said your mother already has this reputation. You're her daughter. You're not going to be given any benefit of the doubt on any of your histrionics. And by your own admissions, it sounds like you're being pretty histrionics here. You're in a cult surrounded by cult members. Nothing good is going to come of it. Nothing as good is going to come of any of it. In a communist country, mind you. In a communist country, mind you. Understand something. Your friends that you're talking to that don't, or who are mad at Gorbachev's changing of regular, were wrong. Are wrong. They're into oppression and suppression and suppressing speech and freedom and liberty. They're either dumb or they're evil. They're not good people. There are no good people. Not that there were no good people in the Soviet Union, but anybody bitching in 1991 about the fucking wall coming down and communism falling is not anybody whose opinion should be fucking valued one bit. Because whether it's communist oppression or your fucked up church's oppression, oppression is oppression. And you're just surrounded by it, immersing yourself in it. And you think you're going to get anywhere with your family history, with your mother, 20 years in the church of this. All they're saying is, oh, she's just like her mother. Shut the fuck up. I mean, you're probably one of the easiest ones to target. International phone calls had to be arranged in advance in the Soviet Union, too. Sounds like a great place. I mean, it sounds like a great place. Sounds like a culture I'd want to definitely, I'd want to get myself into. You could not just call any country you wanted whenever you felt like it. You had to set up a call with an operator and then be available for the phone to ring at the predetermined time. I talked with my narcissist mother a few times while I was living there. She never asked any questions about how I was doing. In fact, she tried to tell me what Russia was like. She had been watching TV and reading Time magazine, so she knew more than I did, apparently, even though I was living there. We usually argued whenever we spoke, and one time I got so mad that I hung up on her. I redialed the operator and begged to resume the call, saying it had been cut off, but the woman said "Niet" very sternly, and I figured she had been listening in. The KGB sometimes monitored our calls, and I knew that because one time when I was talking to a friend in Germany, I heard strange clicking sounds, and I joked maybe it was the KGB, and then the phone call had been abruptly cut off. Sounds like a great place. Sounds like a great place. It was quite a historic time to be there. The economy was bad. The worst of it had been since the war, which had claimed 27 million Soviet lives. There were food shortages declared in Leningrad, and we were given rationing coupons for staples like bread, flour, butter, sugar, vodka. Yes, the government paid for our vodka. The Soviet government was our employer, actually, and we were paid in rubles, in cash handed to us in an envelope on the third floor of a television center every Thursday. We were paid approximately 50 American dollars per month, although by now the inflation was so bad that the actual pay fluctuated from week to week. When word got out that foreigners were being paid by the government to work there, protesters showed up in front of the television center. Money was tight, pensioners could not get by on what little they were given, and then they sat in their slush outside the Renoc, the public market, begging for money or selling plastic bags for a few kopecks. Sounds like a great place. Sounds like a great system of government, to be honest with you. Sounds like a great system of government. Or they stood behind the crates outside the metro and sold bundles of herbs, mushrooms, or vegetables gathered from their dachas. $50 per month may not sound like a month, might not may not sound like a lot even in the 90s, but it was enough to rent an apartment in Soviet Russia and feed a family for a month. Despite the tumultuous times and hardship living with Suka Zarina, I enjoyed the work that I did there. Among other things, I helped produce a Soviet dating game show called Find Me. The show was being overhauled, and Koila was the producer. He was only 20 years old, but he was quite a talented and ambitious young man. He composed music and sometimes would take me down into one of the studios, which was not in use, and we would play the piano and sing. I sang on Soviet television a couple times, performing for a group of Red Army soldiers one time, and a second time performing a song which was composed for me by a famous songwriter named Igor Azarov. He had to sneak me into a Soviet army base to record it, using the old reel-to-reel equipment that the army choir used, while we were recording the song, which I later lip-synced live on a TV for a New Year's broadcast to Find Me. A Soviet officer walked in and asked me who I was. Igor replied that I was an Amerikanka. The officer said CHTO, meaning what? But he kept quiet about my presence there because Igor was his friend. In any case, I did not learn any state secrets, and the KGB never did come knocking, though I did go dancing with some KGB and CIA people in Bonn, Germany, but I'll save that for the book. This is turning into the book. Isn't this the book? There are way too many stories to tell here, but this is already getting too long. As winter turned into spring, the project director informed Zuka that it was time for her to go home to the States. She had caused too many problems with the Wallabies, who were fed up with her refusal to take direction, her hostility, and all of her backstabbing of us to the Soviets. The Russians, except for the young men in her fan club, were also displeased with her for causing so much contention. They were more comfortable with associating with the Wallabies. With Zuka gone, I went to live by myself in a studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. I enjoyed this newfound freedom. In fact, I felt freer in the Soviet Union than I ever felt in the States. That's scary. It's because you're in a cult. Not because you were in our country. Not because you're an American. There were no more, and you were in, and the only reason you felt free because all of that was crumbling. All that communism was crumbling around you. You were getting into another cult that was disbanding. That's why you were feeling free at that point. There were no more spies other than the KGB who were not interested in me in any way. Right, they were about to overthrow Gorbachev. When was that? 90, yeah, summer 91? Summer 91? Fall 90, or 91, 92. They were about to overthrow that dude. I believe it was like September 91. September 91 was like when they tried to overthrow him. Other than the KGB, who were not interested in me anyway, I could finally relax and be myself for the first time in years. I also had 2 weeks vacation by the Black Sea where I met a handsome blonde coal miner from Rostov named Sasha and had my first romantic encounter. I was 25 and finally lost my virginity. I had been flirting and nothing more, and though I enjoyed it, I was also deeply ashamed of my actions. I had betrayed the church even though I kept it secret and had been careful not to fool around while I was in Leningrad. Sex before marriage was a major sin, and I would be sent home if the ministry had known, and probably disfellowship too. Shortly after I returned from vacation in August '91, there was a coup. Yeah, exactly. I knew it was like late summer, early fall. That coup, when communism officially collapsed. Shortly after vacation in August 1991, there was a coup. CNN dubbed it 7 days that shook the world. Gorbachev was taken hostage by communist hardliners, and there was massive protests in Moscow and Leningrad. The Wallabies ordered me to stay in my apartment while they drove around the city taking photographs and reporting on what had happened. But I was annoyed they were driving around while I was told to stay inside. So moments later, I darted out the door with my camera dangling from my hand. I took the metro to the Winter Palace, where 250,000 people were gathered. I remember thinking how ironic that was to see people protesting against communism in the same place where the Bolsheviks had taken power some 70 years ago. I also went to the television center where a makeshift tank brigade had been built because of a rumor that the tanks were on their way from Moscow. I returned to my apartment. The little plastic phone was ringing off the hook. Wallaroo was furious at me for disobeying orders. She informed me that President H.W. Bush had advised all American citizens living in Russia to come home, and that the church administration had ordered us to pack our bags. Our tickets had already been purchased and we would leave the next day. I cried my eyes out. I didn't want to leave. Krill, Koila, and another friend, Dima, came to the apartment to keep me company. I would not stop crying. I was not sure if it was just the coup or everything else that had finally overwhelmed me, but the tears would not stop flowing. Dima rubbed my back, and I was grateful to my Russian friends for consoling me, even though their country was falling apart. My Aussie colleagues, too, had also had their caring moments, but they always came at it from a position of superiority, and it made me uncomfortable. I really treasured my Russian friends. Anyway, after a tense couple days trying to get a flight out, there was some kerfuffle with the tickets, and it turned out we did not have to leave. The hardliners had given up. Gorbachev was released, and during his last days in office, he dismantled the Soviet Union, then resigned, making Boris Yeltsin Russia's first president. Soon after, the mayor of Leningrad renamed the city St. Petersburg, as it had been known before the 1917 revolution. The USSR was no more. Thank God. Russia had given me a lot of time to reflect upon my life. Even though my Russian friends were kind to me, I was still alone most of the time, and during those long winter nights in St. Petersburg, I faced many uncomfortable truths. My mother was abusive to me, but the truth is that I had also been abusive to her. I had become so fed up with her constant jabs and criticisms and how she was always trying to pick a fight that in my late teens I finally hit back. There had been a time that I had thrown a cantaloupe at her. She had cried out when I had hit her for a moment. I was terrified that I had broken her ribs. She had been okay, but the idea that I could hurt her had shaken me to the core. Another time when she had visited me during college, we had gotten into an argument in my car, and in a blind rage, I had pulled her wig off her head. She had jumped out of the car, and had gone running across traffic and I had been stunned by my own actions. I have also been I had also been unkind to my father. Shortly before his death, he had taken mom's side, and yet another fight, in my mom's side, and yet another fight, the way he always had when I was growing up. I can't recall what the fight was about, but I was so angry at him for taking her side again that I told him I hoped he would die in his sleep. It was the last time I spoke to him before he died, and he really did die in his sleep. Even though he molested me as a child, I never fully held him accountable because of his mental disability. That's bullshit. That's bullshit. So I felt tremendous guilt and shame about my cruel words to him. I also knew that I needed to leave the church as soon as I left Russia. It wasn't right to keep pretending that I believed when I no longer did and maybe never had. I began planning my escape. This is another place to take a break. Up next, my return to the U.S. and career in TV news and the continuing drama with my family. Do you know why you were able to leave at that point? Because you saw communism fall, the same type of cult you were in, and you saw if that can fall, then if people can leave communism, then I can leave this. I will tell you this. You telling me that you have tricholatum, I know what it is. I have other people. I've dealt with other people with the condition. It is an obsessive condition. Okay? And it makes you like you're unaware when you're even doing it. And what also comes along with that is you're unaware of when you're being histrionic, and when you're just where people just like, I've had it. It makes sense now with your stories and all that of what's going on. No good was going to come out of you going to Russia, being with this church, being around anybody associated with this church. It wasn't until you took your main cult and you tried to absorb into a new cult. But once you saw communism die, and you saw that chain could be broken, that's why you were able to finally leave your church. That's what I think pushed you over the edge and gave you the courage. Like, wow, because it was one oppressive ideology and another like they're both oppressing you. They were both crazy cults. So you were able to leave one by seeing another fail. I think that's what happened. So I hope that helps. Thank you so much for another contribution and story, Apostle's Niece. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody watching. Please leave any opinions or advice in the comment section below. And again, if you want your story read on the channel, you have a topic you'd like me to cover, a narcissist you'd like to expose, you'd like to have a private video made, or you'd just like to make a contribution to the channel in general to keep it supported, growing, and successful, because this channel survives 100% on contributions from all of you. Without you guys, all this goes away. So if you like what you see here and you want to see more videos like this, you know what to do with the PayPal and email links in the description box. Also, please like and share this video wherever you can. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and be sure to click the subscription bell to be notified of all my video uploads. I'm Ollie Matthews. This has been the Narcissistic Resistance. And also, the queue is now empty, so anything with contribution will be immediate. Take care, everybody. Bye.